Hello all, welcome back to our channel. So in this video we will talk about gate driver functionality. So gate driver functionality, for experienced people it looks as if this is nothing new, but for some of the beginners or students they might want to know more about what this gate driver does and why do we need gate driver in circuits. Let us start straight away. So if you look at this image, right? In this image, a person is trying to push a car. Car is a heavy thing, right? A person with his energy may not be able to push a car single-handedly. He might need some support to drive this car, to push this car basically. So he might bring in additional people, or he might bring in some other vehicle, tie it with a rope and then pull it away, or whatever. So definitely he needs some support. He cannot do it on his own. Similarly, when we are trying to drive heavy loads, and when we are saying drive, basically in embedded circuits we will have a controller which has to drive those loads. So when we want to drive this, the microcontroller, we know that the GPO pins or whatever, the frequency generating pins like the PWM pins doesn't have the enough energy, we should say. Basically, if we are talking about electric terms, it's a power to drive those MOSFETs. So in those cases we need to add some circuit in between, such that the control that is driven from microcontroller is boosted, and then it drives the further loads. So to put it, if you see this block diagram, you see that the microcontroller is trying to drive a MOSFET IGBT circuit with a driver IC. So if you are having a huge power conversion circuits where these MOSFETs further drive some motor or something, and then these are power MOSFETs kind of things, you definitely need to switch them very fast. You need good drive current to the gates. So in those cases, the driver IC is a must. So when we talked about a vehicle, so you can think this as a vehicle, and then this as a man who was trying to drive it, and he used this driver IC to drive this. So these driver ICs, basically called the gate drivers, are used for several applications. So the driver could be only driving a low side MOSFET. Low side MOSFET is something, it is drawn here, where there is an N-channel MOSFET, and the MOSFET source is connected to ground, and such and then load is connected through the supply. So such a configuration is called a low side driver, whereas in high side driver the power supply is directly connected to the MOSFET to a P channel, and then the load is connected to the ground, and basically the load is between the high side MOSFET and the ground. So such a circuit is called high side MOSFET. So while driving these, we require the low side MOSFET driver and high side MOSFET driver. And then when we go to solenoid kind of scenarios, we have half bridge MOSFET drivers. And then when we go to motor drivers, DC motors, we need full bridge MOSFET driver, and then for AC motors we need three-phase MOSFET drivers. So depending on the application, on how we are driving the end load, how the MOSFET configuration is, we will have different driver ICs available. So it is depending on the application that the designer is using these, he has to select those. So while we read all this, we will just talk about the definition. So we must have talked about the definition at the beginning, but if we give the basic explanation, and then it would be easy for anyone to understand the definition. So the definition of gate driver is nothing but a gate driver is a circuit which accepts a low drive output, that means from a microcontroller kind of scenarios, or it could be a DSP, it could be a processor, whatever, from controllers, and then amplifies the output. So here basically it provides the enough current to the gate of the MOSFETs that we are talking, and this gate could be of a MOSFET, power MOSFET basically, or a IGBT, where we all find these in mainly in the power conversion circuits, the motor drive circuits, where we see, or predominantly in the electrical vehicle which we are talking these days. These gate drivers definitely play a significant role, and then in inverters, all these circuits. So this is just to give a glimpse of how a high side driver is connected using LTC1157 from analog. So it is taken from analog devices chipset driver data sheet, where we have a MOSFETs which are driven through the gate drivers. So the gate driver, so LTC1157. You can see here this gate driver is driving the MOSFETs, and then you can see here this is a 3.3 volt logic. 3.3 volt logic will be from the microcontroller. So this is just to give us an understanding of how the driver is going to control. And then ultimately, while we talked about the driver, we need to know what are the specifications, how we need to control all these, right? So the first main point is, when you select a driver IC, you have to select a driver IC which is within the operating voltage, and then how you interface to the microcontroller is another important point. So from the microcontroller, it could be just a GPIO that is driving the that could drive the driver IC, or the driver IC might have some serial interface like SPI, I2C, where the microcontroller would be driving the driver through that interface, configuring the driver to perform its activities at its output. So depending on how the designer wants to do it, so that could be the interface related. And then we could have a requirement where we might have to switch at a very high frequency at the output. Like we have, if you have a power conversion which is happening at a very high speed, we need to switch the outputs quickly, right, at a high frequency. So if you have to switch the outputs from the at the output of the MOSFET quickly, these MOSFETs need switch quickly, right? If these MOSFETs have to switch quickly, the microcontroller has to provide them at that rate, and this driver IC should not uh, add an additional delay such that you may not be able to achieve that frequency. So in those cases, you should have a driver IC which has the propagation delay as less as possible, like in terms of nanoseconds or something. So that is another important parameter when you select a driver IC. And then in some of the circuits, like high power applications, you might have to isolate your controller circuit from the high frequency circuit. So in those scenarios, you might have to isolate these two, where the driver IC would be providing that isolation. So that means this control circuitry at the left would be completely isolated with the from the MOSFET circuitry, high power circuitry. So driver ICs are available with that isolation. So it is if you wanted isolation, you select a driver IC with the isolation, or a non-isolated driver IC. And then ultimately, when you drive a MOSFET, let us assume if there is a short circuit that happens in the bridge, So that means there is some overcurrent that is going to flow, right? Or the short circuit scenario. So in these scenarios, the driver IC must be able to stop the control to MOSFET such that your circuit does not get damaged. So short circuit protection and any over voltage protection that comes onto the rails, all these the driver IC must be able to protect. So this is an additional protection for the driver IC to perform its activities. So these are some of the major parameters where we might have to which we might have to consider for selecting a driver IC. And then ultimately the manufacturers. So there are several manufacturers of gate driver ICs. We might have used many of them in our circuits. So mainly if you go to the automotive sector, we see most of the Infineon based driver ICs being used. So other than that, for all different applications, we all know from Texas Instruments that DRV chip is very famous. We might have used it. Microchip is another manufacturer. Analog devices, which we have talked before, on semiconductor, ST Microelectronics, and there are several others as well. So these are some of the manufacturers of gate driver ICs. So hope you got a glimpse of what a gate driver IC, what it performs, and why we need it, and who manufactures these chips, right? Please let us know if you have any comments on this video. Please post your suggestions. Please let us know if you have any other learnings with respect to gate driver ICs. Please like and subscribe our channel. Thank you.